Hey guys, Thetcglover here, cut video today. I went to my locals on Friday and I had a little chat with someone who has played the game for a while and he's topped multiple YCSs. You know, we both play the same deck, we're both playing Mermails at the moment, and we sat down and had a little chat and we discussed a theoretical theory, which doesn't make much sense, but a theoretical theory in Yu-Gi-Oh! Which people don't really talk about much, but I like to call it pseudo advantage. Now, he came up with the word and I instantly knew what he was talking about, but I think it's worth going into why pseudo advantage is now becoming an incredibly important aspect of the game that a lot of players are like, they think about it when they're playing, but they don't actually have a way to describe what they're talking about. They can understand why some decks are bad or why some decks are deceptively good, but they can't really explain why. So I think using a term called pseudo advantage is a really good way to explain why some decks in the meta right now are better than they really are, and I think some players are don't really understand exactly why they're good. So let's just go into it. So pseudo advantage. Pseudo is Latin meaning like fake, not genuine, not realistic. It's hard to explain, but pseudo basically means not real. And advantage, obviously, in Yu-Gi-Oh! Meaning when you have more cards than your opponent, you have more cards to use to beat your opponent with. You know, you've got more outs. So basically, the whole point of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a game of advantage. You want to generate advantage while taking advantage away from your opponent, so then you win. Because if you have 100 life points and they have 1,000, or not 1,000, but 8,000, but they have one card and you have 7, then you're ultimately winning, because you know they can't get that last 100 off you unless they top deck something amazing and take you out right there. Dark hole, summon something, attack. That doesn't always happen. So generally being 7 cards ahead but being only 100 life points left is generally the better place to be, because you can just keep plowing their life points down. They have no cards to stop you. So pseudo advantage together, the term really means that the advantage is there, but within the context of the current game state, the advantage is subject to be lost with ease, or it can be used to exert pressure on the opponent. That sounds really confusing, but when I say that, it means like a deck can generate a lot of advantage, but this advantage is irrelevant if all the cards gained are complete rubbish. Now, we're going to take a very non-meta example. So let's think about Ajamas, okay? They have Oja Magic, and it's one of the best ways to describe pseudo advantage, because once you discard Oja Magic, you can search a yellow, a black, and a green Ojama and add them to your hand. So you take one card out your hand and you replace them with 3 normal monsters. Now, you're looking at the cards in your hand and you're looking at what your opponent has, and you realize that you have less cards than them, but you realize that they've searched 3 normal monsters and you can't really use them. I mean, unless you use Ojama Red to special summon them, and then you have to have Delta Hurricane, you really are negging your hand quite a lot just to get those 3 Ojamas on the field. So Oja Magic is such a pseudo advantage card where a bad player will look at the fact that they have so many cards in hand and they'll go, oh, what am I going to do? I have to play differently to have to overcome this advantage that they've gained so that I stay ahead. And it's like, no, you still on the same cards. You have the same amount of cards that you both have that are playable. You know, you have 6 or 5 playable cards in hand, and they've got like 8 cards in hand, 4 of them of which are playable, and the other 3 are Ojamas, you know, and they can't be used unless you have the right cards in hand. So it's whether or not you have to remember that and realize that that's pseudo advantage. Just completely ignore the fact that they have Ojamas in their hand and play the other cards in their hand. You are still ahead on cards. So in that sense, Ojamas generate a lot of pseudo advantage, and that's why some players can beat them and some players can't. And you know, it's a very rogue deck, so you should be able to beat that deck even without thinking about pseudo advantage. A meta relevant example, which is why this video is worth watching, is something like Fire Fist. They can grab Tensins with Dragon, they can even grab Tenkins, but Tenkin is not really played that much, so you don't have to worry about it. But Tensin obviously allows you to boost up your Fire Fists. Tenkis and Tensus can be searched with Bear and Tiger King. Point is though, is that all these cards don't go to the hand, they go set on the field. So a Tensin is going to be just boosting up attack and defense. So realistically, if you don't attack, the card doesn't do anything. You know, obviously they can send it with Bear to pull up a monster on the field, but realistically, if you don't attack, the card doesn't do anything. So it doesn't actually count as advantage until you actually play into the card. Tenkies will get you cards, okay? But Tenki in itself sits on the field. so it doesn't do anything, and it gains 100 attack points, but that 100 attack is pretty much irrelevant when you start realizing it's an advantage game, not so much a attack over each other kind of game. I mean, Bujins and Fire Fist have that kind of thing right now where it's a matter of just attacking over each other, but realistically with Legacy of the Valiant, Exciton Knight is the reason why pseudo advantage really comes into its own as a kind of theoretical topic to talk about. Yeah, so none of these Fire Fist or Fire Formation cards really matter if they can be lost in an instant. Having Tensen, means that you don't have to attack into it, something like that. But the video, really why I made it was because Exciton Knight allows you to capitalize on this pseudo advantage generated by Madolche and Fire Fist and Ajamas, or I guess like even Harpies as well, but Harpies put it in their hand. Point is though is that Madolche's gush onto the field and Fire Fist do it as well, and basically you draw to your turn, they have 4 cards in hand, you have 4 cards in hand, and they've got like 3 cards on their field or 4 cards on their field, a Tiger King with 3 back row, but you know that one of them is a Tenki because it's face up, one of them is going to be like a Tensen, and you might have something else like a Bottomless, and that's it. So you know what the 2 cards are, you know that they have Tiger King, you're not going to play into Tiger King, you're not going to attack the Tiger King because they're going to boost up to 3300, you won't be able to win that fight. Exciton Knight allows you to basically look at what they have and you realise that they have more cards than you do, so you can Exciton Knight them. You don't have to worry. I mean, they might Bottomless it, but you manage to use 2 cards in hand. Hopefully you actually replace one of those cards when you do it, like using gadgets or something, or using something like Mermails, because you can generate advantage by using Gunday and Abyss Pike. Exciton Knight allows you to look at what your opponent has on the field, and the fact is, because they put so many cards on the field, they allow you to fulfill the Exciton's requirement and put yourself 3 or 4 cards ahead of your opponent. They might have the same cards in hand as you do afterwards, but ultimately you've taken out so many cards on their field and you still have your monster, provided that they don't Bottomless it. But that is why cards like Exciton Knight is so good. Not only does it allow you to put yourself back in the game when you are losing, but even when you have less cards than your opponent, you are aware that their advantage is because their cards cannot be used unless you play into them. Yeah, so simply put, even though that these advantage cards are just there, and you have to play into them, and they get played into a lot. You attack and they tense in, you're like, oh god, I've just got myself tensed. They get another Fire Formation with Bear or whatever, or Gorilla. The fact is that you can completely disregard it if you Exciton Knight them, and Exciton Knight is easy to fulfill. And I keep repeating that, it's because like you put yourself back on equal cards, but the fact is that you can actually, even though you're behind on cards in terms of counting the amount of actual cards that your opponent has together, 3 cards on the field, 4 cards in hand, to your 5 cards in hand, for example, then you know that you can Exciton Knight them, and not only do you get to level the playing field, but you were already ahead because the cards that you knew that were on their field, you already know what they are because you saw them search them. So that's it. You Exciton Knight them and they lose everything on their field, but everything on their field was pointless. So ultimately you are taking away anything that they could use to generate advantage, but they don't actually have any sort of way to stop Exciton Knight at all, because everything they search can't really negate Exciton Knight unless they use Tenkin, but they don't use Tenkin. Right, so with something like Madolche, for example, they're basically reliant on your opponent, basically just popping multiple cards at once, okay? For instance, like using stuff like Mermails to pop your monsters, and obviously you have Shadow and you have Ticket, and they allow you to just basically keep adding cards back to your hand. So what you really need to do is you need to kill the monsters, and you need to kill the whole field at the same time, basically, and that's the only way that you're going to kill Madolche. Even after Angeli comes out, if you have a way to just blow up the entire field, right, and stop them from getting their cards back to the hand once they're destroyed, then that is the best way to beat Madolche, because they will have to commit cards on their hand to blurt out this field. They will know that once their stuff dies, it will go back to their hand, so they will commit like 4 cards in their hand to the field, so they have 1 or 2 cards left in their hand, and then you Exciton Knight them using only 2 cards in your hand, blow up their field, and then they don't get their stuff back, they lose everything, okay? They have to top deck, or they have to hope that one of their other 2 cards is another way to generate advantage. That is the best way to deal with Madolche, and I think that Madolche and Fire Fist are both subject to pseudo advantage. You can easily Exciton Knight them, and pretty much level the playing field. I mean, Madochi, I don't think I'm scared of them. I always lose to them because the mechanic, the way that they abuse it, is incredibly good. But Exciton Knight is one way, as well as Black Rose Dragon, it's one way to completely disregard their whole mechanic and just teach them a lesson. I think that in itself is what makes Exciton Knight such a good card. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this video. I hope it makes some sense. If it doesn't make any sense at all, just comment down below and say that it doesn't make any sense, that I'm talking complete crap. But I feel like I've developed this theory in my head with other people who I talk to, and they all kind of agree that it is a thing that's worth talking about. It's worth considering when you're playing against a deck and you realize that going into certain cards will benefit you more in the long run. Even if you're behind on so many cards, you realize that it's not just about leveling the playing field, but it's also about keeping an eye on what they have and personalizing the advantage to a point where you know that certain cards that you can play against them will get around this advantage and actually take out multiple cards at once, and then they're like, oh shit, I can't do anything. I hope to see you guys in a few days. Definitely do comment and like, subscribe and all that stuff, and I'll see you guys in a few days. And until next time, the Tzetglover is out.